All right, hey guys, we are back and we are talking about Georg Simmel today. So here's the deal with Simmel. He, in my opinion, probably deserves a place with the rest of the big three. There probably should be a big four: Marx, Weber, Durkheim, and Simmel. That's my opinion. I'm going to make an argument for why that's the case. You don't have to buy it. And I'm also going to make an argument for why I think he is not included in with those big guys. Um, First, the argument for why. He, out of all of them, and you guys know I'm a big fan of Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, he comes up with, I think, the best conceptualization of the big problem. Remember, Marx had his with alienation, Durkheim has his with a lack of regulation, Weber has his with the iron cage of rationalization. Simmel's big problem is what he calls the tragedy of culture, which I'll explain after I get through this introductory bit about him. Um, and I think it's really compelling. We'll see what you guys think. The reason I think he is not a part of it, despite the quality of that and the quality of his overall work, is that he wrote about everything. So Marx is pretty focused, right? He wants to overturn capitalism, so he like starts with commodities and then builds out from there, but it's all focused. Durkheim is pretty focused on what we need to do to create a common morality, and Weber is focused on this idea of rationalization, that as we go through history, we are becoming more and more rationalized. Simmel writes about everything. So he writes about interaction, although really differently than me. I'll see what you guys think about it. He writes about the form of interaction, not the content of interaction, but what makes an interaction between two people different than an interaction between three people, regardless of what they're interacting about. So he talks about that. But he also talks about money and what it means if you organize an entire society around money. What effect is that going to have on people? But he also focused on just specific worlds, like the world of fashion or the world of art. He also talked about what it's like to be a stranger in a place and what are the pros and cons of that for not just the individual, but the other people who might relate to the stranger. He talked about urbanization and the effect that that had on people. So what you can see, and this is not like a comprehensive list. He is basically anything that appeals to him, he writes about. And the reason he can do that, and I'm going to get to this term later on, is he believed in methodical relationism. The idea here is that every element of society is related to every other element of society. So in studying the effect that money has on people, you might end up studying the relationship between bosses and their subordinates, which might lead you to a study of just dyads or superordination, subordination in a general way. He just went everywhere, and I think that lack of focus, which I don't mean that to sound derogatory. I mean, it's amazing. He's comprehensive. He writes about everything, but I think that it makes it harder for people to kind of grasp him the way Marx, Weber, and Durkheim are graspable. So what that's going to mean for this series of lectures, which remember, he's on the B team, so he's only going to get 3 or 4 lectures from me. What that's going to mean is, whereas you got even though it was only 7 or 8 lectures, you got Marx in a pretty summary way. You got Durkheim in a pretty summary way. For Simmel, it's not going to be a summary. It is more going to be selections. I'm going to put them in an order, and he writes in a grand theory way, so there is an order to it. It's just he wrote so much that sometimes it's hard to connect the puzzle pieces. You can't, whereas what you got from me on Marx or Weber and Durkheim, you can say, I got the basics. With Simmel, you got some of the basics, or you're going to get some of the basics. Okay, so let's see. Let's talk about why I think he is deserves to be part of the Big Four, and it's this idea of the tragedy of culture. So Marx had his alienation. Human beings are not being able to live fulfilling lives because of capitalism. Durkheim has his thing of humans are not able to live fulfilling lives because they're not being regulated properly. Weber has his thing about rationalization and about how our future is this icy cage that we'll never escape from. Simmel's thing is this. He says people are creative, although he is more comprehensive in his understanding of our creativity than Marx was. Remember, Marx was we interact with nature and produce things, even if we're artists. That's what we're doing. For Simmel, the creativity is more about transcending the normalcy of life. So there is just you wake up and you're going about your normal day and things are fixed and they're expected of you. And Simmel said that is not the way people are. People want to transcend that, go beyond that. So it could be creating a work of art. It could be making something that's useful, but it could also be surprising somebody with a gift. That is a creative activity, a creative act that because that wasn't what the situation of normal life required. It might be making a joke. That's again a moment of improvisation. So that's what he says that people are like. But the tragedy of culture, and this is a little bit sophisticated, you may need to rewind this, is he says every time we create, we have made another piece of culture. And that stuff that we made, he calls objective culture. It's not just physical objects, but he means it as in they are things that we made and now they exist external to us. They are objects. He says that as we go along creating and improvising and transcending, there is just more and more and more of this stuff. And that stuff comes to dominate our lives. That's the tragedy of culture. Through our just normal being human beings, we create, but our creations come to dominate us. And we can see that, I mean, kind of today in terms of the fact that we talked about this, I think, with the Iron Cage of Rationalization. It's much easier for me to have an efficient but meaningless experience by, picking up pizza rather than making something at home. Simmel is saying it's not just about efficiency, it's every single thing. All of this stuff just weighs down on us and weighs down our ability to be that sort of transcendent person that we're supposed to be. All right. That is the essence of the tragedy of culture. If you didn't get that from my first little introduction to it, that's okay. I'm going to come back to it in the last video, and I think we will get it a couple more times in between. Scrolling down, let's see here. Oh, and sorry, the result of this, of it oppressing us, is that we become cynical and we become unimpressed, indifferent to things. We can't have these kind of meaningful experiences, sort of a similar thing to what Weber said. But for Simmel, it's not just about rationalization. It's not just about efficiency. It's just about the sheer quantity of stuff that we've produced. And since we're going to keep producing stuff, that's where the tragedy comes in. Okay, but getting there is going to be a little bit of a process for us because we've got to work through Simmel's sort of three-tiered, which is our next step, three-tiered model of social reality. It's fairly simple, this part. The first tier is just the psychological components of social life. He believed that we are interactionists and that we come to understand things through interaction with other people. But he did believe that we have this core to us. And this core is really kind of relates to that tragedy of culture thing. he calls human beings there's a quote, bearers of the life process. About that, he meant that we are creative beings, always driven to transcend what is fixed and stable, which I talked about. That is his base for people. It's not just that we're creative, like Marx thought of us. It's that we are driven to transcend our experiences. Because the fixed bores us, we are driven to do something to transcend that. He also says, in addition to that, that's his big thing, that bearers of the life process. But he also says we're consciously oriented toward one another, which is a Weber thing, right? We conceptualize and make meaning. He said that we have individual consciences that are internalized norms and values, which should remind you of Durkheim. He also said we can think about ourselves. We can reflect on ourselves, which should remind you of George Herbert Mead, who we just covered. So anyway, that's the first tier, the psychological components. The second tier, well, we're going a little bit long, but I've tried to get this done in under 15. The second tier, so you've got these individuals, bearers of the life process, who are attuned to interpreting the people and themselves. So what do? At a most basic level, they interact. So the second tier is interactions. And he's going to spend a lot of time studying that. I talked to you about that with regard to dyads and triads earlier. So the second tier is going to be interactions. He called them associations. And what he meant is we associate with each other. He didn't mean like organizations. That's not where we are yet. And so that is where he will kind of begin, because he's really our first interactionist. We covered George Herbert Mead last time, and he's the father of symbolic interactionism. Georg Simmel precedes him by just a couple of years. So he's really, they're probably thinking about it around the same time, but Simmel's getting stuff down on paper a little bit earlier. The third tier of Simmel's social reality is the structures and changes in the social and cultural sort of spirit of the time. He was hesitant to use the word society. He thought society is just basically a bunch of people interacting. But he said we definitely, out of these interactions, we build things. And that's the third level. Okay, so that takes us down to these last two. So these last two are two overarching approaches of his. So he has this three-tiered conceptualization of social reality. I don't want to say society with him, but of social reality. These two principles are kind of how he approaches things. First principle is the principle of, two approaches. The first is the principle of emergence. And the idea is that as we go up in these tiers, from individual consciousness to interaction to larger structures, he says each one emerges from the previous ones. So it is out of our being the bearers of the life process that we create interactions. And then those interactions, through interacting, we create these bigger things. That's all the principle of emergence means. Second is methodical relationism, which I talked to you about before. It's why I think it ends up being excluded from the sort of top pantheon of sociologists. It's that everything interacts with everything else. Which I personally find kind of persuasive. I mean, it does make it hard to categorize some of his stuff. Some of it just sort of sticks out there. Like he writes an entire article on the stranger, and it's a little hard to figure out how it gets integrated with the rest of it. But we're at about 15 minutes, so let me finish up by just saying in the next video what we're going to do, because I've told you about tier 1, about his idea of human consciousness. So next one, we're going to start with interactions. You're going to find, as I said before, they're going to be a little bit different than the way Mead approaches it. Meaning is not going to be what he's focused on. What he's focused on is form. So I'll see you in that one.